Welcome to Brief Encounters and a May episode of the Securities Regulation and Enforcement series. My name is Valerie Mirko. I'm a partner at Armstrong Teasdale, as well as the leader of the firm's Securities Regulation and Litigation practice. And with me is my co-host, William Nelson. William, I was hoping you could go ahead and introduce yourself as well as today's topic, please.
Absolutely, and thank you, Valerie. Yeah, and William Nelson, I'm Director of Public Policy, Associate General Counsel at the Investment Advisor Association. Today, we're going to be talking about Department of Labor, some new rulemakings coming out, kind of what their priorities are. I'm also going to touch on some SEC issues, standards of care, IPOs, and also talk a little bit about Congress. But thankfully, we're not alone. We're very happy today to have a distinguished guest, Kendra Isaacson, who is a partner at Mindset. And full disclosure, IA does work with Mindset, so we're very fortunate to have that relationship. But prior to joining Mindset, Kendra did serve as the Pensions Policy Director and Senior Tax Counsel for Patty Murray in the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, also known as Senate Health Committee. Also serves as an adjunct professor, so very close to my heart, and also previously served as a detailee at the Department of Labor, so very well versed on the inner workings of the department. So again, Kendra, just so happy to have you on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Absolutely. So let's just jump in. We definitely have a lot we want to talk about today since we do have Kendra on. But first, Kendra, I was just hoping to kind of get a good read. We have Dan Aronowitz coming on board at EBSA. You've heard, these statements, a new chapter, a new day, both at the SEC and also Department of Labor. Can you kind of talk about maybe what you see his priorities are, but also maybe a little bit of his background, which would color that?
Absolutely. So Dan Aronowitz was previously the CEO of Encore Fiduciary, a fiduciary liability insurance company. And so he comes to this job with a really deep understanding of the, ERISA litigation landscape. And so I think his primary focus is curbing ERISA litigation that he feels is frivolous and has really gotten, it's increased over the past several years. So, and if you have had the joy of reading the 70 some pages investment selection proposal, you'll see that is a constant theme that's repeated a number of times about, the proposal is designed to curb ERISA litigation. So I think that's the first and foremost goal for Aronowitz. And then secondly, I keep using this, but I'm not sure that it's totally accurate, but I keep saying it's a kinder, gentler EBSA at DOL in their new era, their golden era. But really, I think they've signaled a real change in enforcement. They're focusing more on compliance assistance by reopening their advisory opinion portal and hope to give more specific tailored guidance on a much quicker basis to plan sponsors as they need it, instead of focusing on, a regulation by enforcement. And so I think those are probably the two biggest themes, a real encouragement for plan sponsors to come in and work with EBSA and not be afraid of enforcement actions. And they have put out some recent guidance, explaining what their enforcement priorities are, which are quite different than they had been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely, Kendra. And, I know it's definitely been well received by a lot of our members. And I really like the way you put it, kind of that kinder, gentler, more focused on compliance assistant rather than playing gotcha. I know you referenced the investment alternatives. So last year, President Trump did put out an executive order back in August talking about democratizing access to alternative investors for, 401k investors' retirement plans. We recently did have the Department of Labor come out with their proposal that would implement this executive order. So I was just hoping you could kind of, walk us through what the proposal is, what it does, and where you see it going.
Absolutely. So the proposal, and I will say it did stem from the executive order about democratizing access to alternative investments in 401k plans. And really in that order, it directed DOL and the SEC, who has yet to act, to, facilitate defined contributions investments in a number of listed alternative investments like private equity, digital assets, real estate, lifetime income, and things like that. So, that's the genesis for this proposal. And they didn't make the deadline, I think, because there were a lot of agencies that had a lot of feelings about this rule. But I do think that it's a bit of a misnomer when you go into reading this rule just expecting it to focus on alternative assets, because it really takes a step back and it focuses on a framework for fiduciaries to what the factors that they need to look at in investing all, assets for a retirement plan, within which they can, analyze more complicated structures and alternative assets. And so this framework is a focus on prudence and a fiduciary's prudence. And so really the core of this proposal is providing maximum discretion and flexibility for plan fiduciaries to make determinations, and really tailoring those determinations on some listed factors, which the Department of Labor insists are not an exhaustive list, but things like fees, benchmarking, performance, liquidity, a lot of considerations. But the rule really is intended to be flexible so that a fiduciary can take these considerations and apply it not only at the plan level, but also at the participant level. So, these determinations are very specific to the plan with which the fiduciaries are working. And so it talks about, providing Skidmore deference to fiduciary decisions in litigation, which they are hoping, the department being they, are hoping will help curb some of the litigation and some of the more frivolous litigation claims. The other part of the proposal is that it sets up a safe harbor so that if you, go through this, it is not intended to be a checklist. I think that is something that people are commenting on. But if you go through these factors, which again are non-exhaustive, then you are deemed to have run a prudent process. And so that's a new structure, a process-based safe harbor without, very clear guidelines. And I think people are grappling with what that actually means. And there are a lot of examples in this proposal, specifically about types of investments and considerations that you should make and look at, if you are paying a little bit more for a certain product, are you getting more benefits out of that product and things like that. So it does provide a ton of flexibility. And I think the reception has been generally positive. There were some concerns that are, stopping some of the congressional action on some of the digital asset legislation that's going through, given the president's ties to the crypto community. And so, I was very pleasantly surprised to see that it is asset neutral and process based, because that's what ERISA is really supposed to do. I always joke, like, let the fiduciaries fiduce. And this proposal is a fiduce framework, basically. So I really like that. That said, no agency writes a perfect proposal out of the bat. And I think there are a lot of very technical and specific details that could use a bit more focus and maybe a few more examples and things like that to ensure that people aren't treating it as a checklist, that fiduciaries do, exercise their independent expertise to make decisions for their plans. That was a very long-winded summary. I hope I answered all the questions you had.
You did, and it was a great summary. And, I am going to steal your fiduciary framework, the two F's. I'll have to remember that one. But I completely agree. The IA is definitely going to comment on it as well, but we believe it's, a very reasonable, well thought out approach, very process based. But sticking on this theme of retirement, last year in the big tax bill, we had what's now called Trump accounts. So, these accounts, this pilot program, allowing newborns to start investing at birth, creates this new type of IRA up until the age of 18. Everyone was very excited. I think it was very well received. We know there's a shortage of retirement savings in this country. But then in his February State of the Union address, President Trump kind of out of nowhere basically just kind of started talking about, well, we have these Trump accounts. It's amazing. We're allowing, these kids to start saving early, but also there's all these forgotten workers that, don't have similar access to retirement plans. And he just kind of started, riffing on, they should be offered plans similar to what federal employees have, and talked about what's called the savers match. And Can you kind of talk about what spawned out of that, this most recent executive order on retirement savings?
Absolutely. And first, I'd like to note, people have problems with the name Trump accounts. If you need to think about them as 530 Cap A's, do whatever you need to do. But I am a Democrat. I work for Patty Murray, not a secret. But I also love these accounts and the possibilities that they hold. And so one way to think about it is as a starter IRA. And so the recent retirement executive order really is an extension of that. So kind of like Trump accounts from birth to death, if you want to think about it that way, or just savings accounts from birth to death. The executive order was a little different than some of us expected, and the administration is going to create a website similar to kind of the Trump RX idea, but for retirement. And it would set some minimum standards for IRAs to be promoted on this trumpira.gov website, cap at 15 basis points. They're going to come out with additional regulations on what the minimum standards are for what it takes to be offered on trumpira.gov, just to make sure that individuals who are not covered by a workplace retirement plan have access to a plan. And I think the reaction from the community has been mixed. From my point of view, I always think it is great when someone with the platform will talk about universal coverage and retirement. And so, again, I am quite supportive of that discussion. Devil's in the details of what works out. But in the executive order, they're also instructing Treasury and the NEC to develop legislative recommendations to not only expand coverage to the 50% of the workforce that doesn't have access to a workplace retirement plan, but also to expand the savers match, which goes into effect at the end of this year, was part of Secure 2.0, has great bipartisan support. And I assume that some of the recommendations will include expanding eligibility for savers match, which is really great. And, anything we can do to help people save and save more and efficiently and reach their goals of financial security and retirement is a good move, in my opinion. So we'll see more there. It's my understanding Treasury is very focused on getting Trump accounts up and running by July 4th, and then they'll focus their attention on implementing the executive order.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm with you there, Kendra. I think anytime we can get people to talk about saving for retirement, kind of no matter, what name is put on the product, I think it's definitely helpful. But, this has been an excellent conversation. Love talking about retirement issues, but, we also talk about the SEC as well. So I'm going to let Valerie take over.
Thank you, William, and thank you, Kendra. This is super helpful, especially for those of us who are, whether we're securities defense lawyers, in my case, I largely defend investigations and exams, but also for my colleagues who are in-house or who do a lot of regulatory work around securities. There's, of course, always some amount of overlap with the DOL. So I really appreciate the context you're giving us. I wanted to go ahead and talk about a slightly different recent initiative, which is coming out of the SEC and specifically Chair Atkins's office, the whole Make IPOs Great Again. Not a new initiative. I remember this during Chair Jay Clayton's term, which, is now 9 years ago. But Chair Atkins, as he's been rolling out his agenda, just like Chair Clayton, he's been encouraging more companies to go public, more of an increase in opportunities for capital formation. He's very consistently noting that the number of publicly traded companies has dropped dramatically over the years, which is true. It keeps coming up every year. So looking at the current push towards opening access to private markets for ERISA plans, how do you see this push of, potentially increasing IPOs? Do you see that slowing down some of the momentum around opening access to private markets for ERISA plans, or do you think both can coexist?
I definitely think both can coexist. And while MIGA doesn't roll off the tongue the same way that MAGA does, it's still a hope, and hope isn't a strategy necessarily for retirement plans. And so I think the Department of Labor will continue their focus on expanding access to plans and ensuring that fiduciaries have the appropriate framework to make these decisions. So I always think of retirement or DOL and SEC sort of as a Venn diagram, and those circles continue to push closer and closer together, and the overlap is getting bigger. But securities language in ERISA, the lawyers don't speak the same language, and it gets very hard to be bilingual in a way. I find it very hard sometimes, when I am trying to work on certain legislation. And so I think the Department of Labor has what they feel is their charge to do. I know that they do coordinate eventually. I still think they will pursue their objectives separately without waiting or slowing down due to another agency.
That makes a lot of sense. And that's what we've seen over the years as well. Shifting gears, because you brought up having multiple regulators around certain issues, I wanted to touch on standards of care. We've had several episodes where we've touched on these issues, whether it's Reg BI, Advisors Act fiduciary duty, state securities fiduciary rules, insurance rules. Like, a lot has happened with standards of care in the last few years, and we've certainly devoted time in all of our seasons of this podcast series. But more specifically, I would say over the past 6 years, we've really seen the broker-dealer industry coalesce around Reg BI, it being the right standard of care for retail customers. It's come up a lot at various securities conferences. Last year, there was a big discussion about it at the FINRA conference, how it was essentially de-risking broker-dealer balance sheets, how certain broker-dealers had to redo their entire product shelves. It was a process, but we're now in 26, 7 years after adoption and 6 years after implementation. And Reg BI is not the sole standard. We've also seen state securities regulators and insurance commissioners putting out rules that provide for clarity and consistency around interactions with customers. Some of these rules have a Reg BI safe harbor, some of them don't, but we've seen greater uniformity by and large, with Reg BI sort of being the center of that uniformity. I'm getting to the however of my question, which is that DOL's fiduciary rule activity, in contrast, has been a seesaw. And we're not seeing coalescing towards a particular outcome. As you've just agreed, there is a seesaw. So at what point does it end? What can firms expect? Is it continued uncertainty? Sort of what's next?
Well, I think anyone who has had to work this issue really would love to see a final ending, a final chapter to this story. But unfortunately, I don't think that's the case in this polarized environment. There's been recent litigation that pulled back the fiduciary rule from the Biden administration. It is on the reg agenda for the Trump administration to propose a new rule. We have a previous Trump administration that should be instructive as to, where they're likely thinking. However, part of that rule, one of the prohibited transaction exemptions, was implicated in the litigation that just pulled everything back. So it is less predictable about where this administration will go. We are back to we're in the hot tub time machine at DOL, back to the 70s with the 5-part test right now. And so we'll just be hanging out there until this DOL opines on where they would like to go with this rule. We are 2 years away from a presidential election and potentially a change in party for administrations, which, suggests to me that we're likely to see a different iteration of this rule in just a couple of years. So unfortunately, I think we are quite a ways away from consensus between the parties on this. I've heard that there are movements in Congress kind of on both sides of the aisle to codify a fiduciary rule, which, I think will be very difficult to get consensus there as well. And this would be a very difficult rule to codify, given that I think the last one was about 1,000 pages. They're quite lengthy, and legislation unless it's a giant omnibus, tends not to be, a tome. So that was a very long-winded way to say we are not done yet. The end is not in sight, and we will all continue to keep working on this. It's good job security for all the attorneys out there.
No, I think that's exactly right. And you also make a great point that this can really only be solved through rulemaking. This is not something that can be resolved through legislation. So that further builds in sort of that seesaw element to your point.
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be, if you are trying to tackle this in a holistic, comprehensive manner, that would be incredibly difficult through legislation. But if you wanted to have a less ambitious rule and focus just on rollovers or something like that, I think that could be the case. But I think every administration feels that they have one shot with this rule. And so ambition rules the day, and they try to, solve for every issue related to this topic.
Yeah, absolutely, Kendra. And, sticking with the topic of Congress, I definitely can't let you off the hook being on the call, but, we had Secure 1.0 back in 2019, Secure 2.0 back in 2022. No need to go on, Cow Shield or Polymarket, but, can you kind of predict maybe what you see, if anything, happening in this Congress, but even potentially, if we do have an administration switch in 2028, obviously we don't know where Congress is going to be, but just kind of, maybe what you see coming out of Congress with respect to any kind of retirement package.
Absolutely. And I will say, I think the makeup of Congress matters a little bit less in this context because retirement has and remains a bipartisan issue, which is quite nice since everything else seems to be so polarized and partisan. A Secure 3.0, I think you've already seen pieces of it being introduced, not in the full complete package, but Senator Cassidy and Senator Kaine have been working together on a number of smaller retirement bills. It's my understanding that Ranking Member Neal from Ways and Means is working on, I think his opening salvo for what a Secure 3.0 might look like. And should the House flip, he would be chair next year. And even when he is in the majority, he loves to work in a bipartisan way. So I would anticipate him working with, if it remains Jason Smith, to do more bipartisan retirement work. So I think you're seeing a lot of bipartisan retirement bills being introduced. They're just not all in a package yet. So this year, you mentioned Kalshi and Polymarkets. I don't use them, but if you were, I would not say that the good odds are on a Secure 3.0 passing this year, but I think you will see a lot of the pieces being introduced, and I think more momentum into next year for a Secure 3.0. That does, I'm not saying that there won't be any retirement passed this year, because there have been some financial services bills that have passed the House. I know Senate Banking is working on their version, and that includes a long awaited resolution of the 403B CIT issue. I am really hopeful that that could find a place in a lame duck package at the end of the year, even if the full, House Financial Services, I think it was called the Invest Act or whatever, the Senate Banking Bill, even if those full bills don't make it in, I'm really hopeful that we can pull that piece out. It's got bipartisan support, and 403Bs deserve the parity that 401ks have with using CITs because they benefit participants. So lower costs, yay. So I'm ending on a hopeful note that hopefully we will get that passed.
Nice. I love it. I love the optimism. We're also very supportive of that 403 bill. We do believe there should be that parity. But again, Kendra, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. What's great about these podcasts is I always learn something.
Thank you so much, Kendra. This was tremendously helpful. I really appreciated how you integrated the legislative, regulatory interplay, as well as contextualizing these DOL issues in sort of the larger securities issues that a lot of us, including our listeners, work through day to day. So this was fantastic. I'm so glad you could join us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.